The wine glass slipped from Kwon Tae-min's hand and shattered against the marble floor of his penthouse office, but he didn't move. He didn't even look down. His eyes were fixed on the phone in his palm, on the small green light that told him the call was still connected. Song Hae-won's voice was still coming through the speaker, sharp and syrupy, the voice she used when she thought no one important was listening. "Listen to me carefully, Amara," she was saying. "Shay." Each word dropped like a stone into still water. "Once this wedding is over, you and that boy will disappear from this house. I don't care where you go. Lagos, Atlanta, the moon. I don't care. But you will not raise Taemin's blood under his own roof while I wear his ring." Taemin's chest went cold. Taemin's blood. He had been on a business call with Hae-won 2 minutes earlier. A routine check-in about wedding caterers, nothing more. When she'd apparently set her phone down without ending it, thinking she'd hung up. She hadn't. And now he was hearing something he was never supposed to hear. His fiancée threatening his housekeeper over a child he didn't know existed. His housekeeper, Amara, the quiet Nigerian woman who arrived 8 months ago with sad eyes and a 5-year-old boy she called her nephew. The boy with the gap-toothed smile who sometimes hummed Yoruba lullabies while sweeping the garden path, and who, Tae-min realized now, his stomach twisting, had his own mother's exact eyes. He set the phone down slowly, not ending the call, letting it keep recording in his mind if nowhere else. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from. If stories about family, justice, and unexpected miracles speak to your heart, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another unforgettable story. Downstairs, 3 floors below the penthouse office, Amara Adeyemi stood frozen in the servants' corridor, her own phone pressed so hard against her ear it hurt. She hadn't meant to answer when Hae-won called. She'd meant to let it ring out, the way she always did, but something in her gut had a pickup this time. Now she understood why. Hae-won knew. Somehow, impossibly, after 8 months of careful lies, forged documents, and a story she'd rehearsed until it felt almost true. "I'm just the housekeeper. He's just my sister's son." Song Hae-won had found out the truth. Amara had crossed an ocean to protect. Little Kunle, 5 years old. The boy who called Amara auntie in public and mama only when they were alone, because his real mother Ngozi was 6 years in the ground, and Amara was the only mother he had left. The boy who was, in every way that mattered by blood, the son of Kwon Tae-min, a man who did not yet know he had a child, and who ran one of the most feared and respected business empires in Seoul, an empire whispered to have roots reaching deep into the city's underworld. Amara's hand trembled as she lowered the phone. Through the corridor window, she could see Kunle in the garden below, chasing a butterfly near the koi pond, laughing the way only a child who doesn't yet know his life is a secret can laugh. She had 6 months left on her visa, 6 months to find the courage to tell Tae-min the truth or watch it be stolen from her by a woman who clearly already knew and clearly intended to bury it. Footsteps echoed on the marble stairs above her. Slow. Deliberate. Amara's blood turned to ice. She knew that walk. She had learned every sound in this house over 8 months. Which floorboard groaned near the kitchen, which door stuck in humidity, which footsteps belonged to security, and which belonged to the man who owned it all. This was Tae-min's walk. But it was different now. Heavier. Wounded, almost, though she had never once heard him sound wounded in all the months she'd worked in his silence. He appeared at the top of the stairwell, phone still in hand, his tailored jacket rumpled from where he must have gripped it. His eyes, Kunle's eyes, she realized with a jolt, or rather, Kunle had inherited them, locked onto hers. "Miss Adeyemi," he said, and his voice cracked in a place she didn't know a man like him could crack. "Whose son is Kunle?" The garden door was open. The afternoon light poured gold across the marble. Somewhere below, Kunle's laughter rang out again, sweet and unknowing. Amara opened her mouth to answer, and found, after 8 months of practiced lies, that she no longer remembered how to tell one. "He's not my nephew," Amara said quietly, the words leaving her like something she'd been carrying too long. "His mother was my sister, Ngozi." Tae-min's face didn't move, but something behind his eyes did, a door creaking open on a room he'd sealed shut for 6 years. "Ngozi," he repeated, and the name sounded foreign and familiar all at once on his tongue, like a language he used to speak fluently and had forced himself to forget. Ngozi Adeyemi, Lagos, the import conference. You remember, Amara said. It wasn't a question. She'd hoped he wouldn't. It would have been easier if he hadn't. I have never forgotten, Tae-min said, and for the first time since she'd met him, his voice wasn't the voice of Kwon Enterprises' cold, precise air. It was the voice of a much younger man, standing in a Lagos hotel garden 6 years ago, falling in love in a language that wasn't his own, with a woman who laughed like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. He had left after 3 weeks. Business had called him home. He had promised to write. He had written for a while, until the letters started coming back marked return to sender, until the number disconnected, until his father, Kwon Sang-ho, sat him down and told him, in the flat voice reserved for matters of family reputation, that the African woman had been paid to disappear and would not be contacting him again. Tae-min had believed his father. He had grieved a woman he thought had taken money and walked away. He had built himself into ice after that, brick by brick, until Song Hae-won, practical, ambitious, born into the right family, became the safest choice a broken man could make. She never took money, Amara said, watching the realization crawl across his face like weather changing. She waited for your letters for 2 years. Your father's men visited her twice. The second time, they made it clear that if she kept trying to reach you, our family's shop in Lagos would burn. She stopped writing to protect us. Not because she stopped loving you. And Kunli was born 8 months after you left. Amara's voice broke for the first time. She raised him alone. She worked 3 jobs. She got sick 2 years ago. The hospitals in Lagos couldn't do enough, and I couldn't raise the money fast enough. And she stopped, steadying herself against the stairwell railing. She made me promise, before she died, that I would find you. Not for money. She was very clear about that. She said Kunli deserved to know where half of him came from. She said you deserved to know you weren't as alone in the world as your father wanted you to believe. Tae-min sat down slowly on the top stair, an act so undignified for a man of his position that Amara almost reached out to steady him before catching herself. Why didn't you just tell me, he asked. The day you arrived. Why the lie? Because I did my research too, Mr. Kwon. Amara's chin lifted, some of Ngozi's old fire flashing in her eyes. I learned what happened to people who threatened your father's plans. I learned about Hae-won's family and the merger and how convenient it would be for anyone standing in the way of that wedding to simply vanish. I needed time. I needed to know if you were your father's son, or if some part of the man my sister loved was still in there before I handed him my nephew's whole future. Something like respect flickered across Tae-min's face, quickly buried beneath the weight of what he'd just learned. Below them, in the garden, Kunle's laughter rang out again. Closer now, running toward the house. Uncle Tae-min, the boy's voice called, using the nickname the household staff had taught him for the master of the house. Come see the fish! They're doing the swimming race again! Tae-min stood, and for a moment, watching him look down the stairwell toward the sound of the boy's voice, Amara saw the exact expression she remembered from 6 years of grief in Ngozi's old photographs. A man falling in love against his own permission. He can't know yet, Tae-min said quietly. Not until I understand what Hae-won knows and how she found out before I did. If she's already planning to remove you both quietly, exposing this now could make you both a target instead of a solution. Amara's stomach dropped. You're not going to tell your father. My father? Tae-min said, and something dangerous had entered his voice now, something that made Amara understand, for the first time, exactly how a man became feared in rooms full of powerful men is the reason I lost 6 years I should have had with my son. I have no intention of telling him anything. Not yet. He looked back at her, and the ice in his expression had reformed, but it was aimed outward now, not at her. Say nothing to Kunli. Say nothing to Hae-won. Continue exactly as you have been. He paused at the top of the stairs. And Miss Adeyemi, thank you for protecting him when I didn't know I needed to. He descended toward the garden, toward the sound of his son's unknowing laughter, and Amara pressed a hand to her chest, feeling Ngozi's promise finally, terrifyingly beginning to come true. 3 floors up, in the office they'd both just left, Tae-min's phone still sat on the desk. And on Haewon's end of that long-forgotten call, a small red light blinked, showing that her own recording app had been running the entire time. She had heard every word. Song Haewon did not raise her voice when she was at her most dangerous. She lowered it. "You're telling me," she said into her own phone, 3 days later, standing in the marble bathroom of her Gangnam penthouse with the water running to mask her words, "that the boy is confirmed. Kwon blood, and Tae-min knows." On the other end, her uncle, Song Min-gu, the family's fixer, the man who made inconvenient problems in the Song business dynasty quietly disappear, exhaled through his teeth. "The lab confirmed it last week, before you ever called that maid. 99.9. He's Tae-min's son. And you didn't tell me sooner because I was hoping we wouldn't need to use it," Min-gu said. "A merger built on a scandal is a fragile merger, Haewon. But if Tae-min already knows and he's protecting them, then the timeline just changed." Haewon turned off the water, studied her own reflection in the mirror. Flawless, controlled. The face of a woman who had spent her entire life being told that composure was a weapon sharper than any blade. "The wedding is in 5 weeks. My father needs that merger signed before the shareholders vote in June, or the Song Group loses its seat on Kwon Enterprises' board entirely. I am not losing everything I've worked for because some maid's nephew turns out to be a bastard heir." "He's not just any bastard heir," Min-gu said carefully. "If Tae-min publicly acknowledges him, Kwon Sang-ho's succession plan changes. You know how the old man feels about bloodline and legitimacy. An illegitimate mixed child, publicly acknowledged, could actually strengthen Tae-min's hand against his own father's board allies. Sympathy, modern optics, an heir who chose family over convenience. It could make you unnecessary to the story entirely." Haewon's jaw tightened. She had spent 3 years cultivating this engagement. Not out of love, she'd stopped pretending that to herself years ago, but out of necessity. Her father's company was hemorrhaging money in a housing market collapse that hadn't yet made headlines. The Kwon merger was the only lifeline sturdy enough to hold her family's empire together, and she was the rope being used to secure it. She would not let a dead African woman's son unravel it. "Find out what Tae-min knows and how he's planning to use it," she told her uncle. "And find out everything about that maid. Real name, real history, real reason she's really in this country. I want leverage before he does." She hung up and stared at her reflection a moment longer. 2 floors below Tae-min's private office, in the household staff wing, Amara sat on the edge of Kunle's bed that night long after he'd fallen asleep, watching his small chest rise and fall, the same way she'd watched her sister do 1,000 nights before the hospital took Ngozi somewhere. Amara couldn't follow. A knock came at the door. Soft, careful. She opened it to find Tae-min standing in the hallway, still in his work clothes, though it was nearly midnight, a manila folder in his hand. "I had someone look into Song Haewon's recent activity," he said quietly, stepping inside only after Amara gestured him in, careful not to wake the boy. Discreetly. "She's already digging into your background. Her uncle runs, let's say, informal investigations for the Song family. If they find your visa situation or the falsified employment documents I suspect you used to get hired here, they'll have you fire me and deport me before you can say a word in my defense." Amara finished. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "I know how this works, Mr. Kwon. I grew up watching my sister get erased from a story that was half hers to tell." Tae-min was quiet for a moment, studying Kunle's sleeping face in the low lamplight. The same slight point at the ear, he realized with a private ache, that he'd inherited from his own late grandmother. "I'm not going to let that happen," he said finally. "You said that about my sister once, too. About writing. About not letting distance decide anything." Amara hadn't meant for it to come out as sharp as it did, but 6 years of grief didn't dissolve simply because the man standing in front of her had finally learned the truth. "Forgive me if I need more than words this time." Something flickered across Tae-min's face. Not anger, but something closer to shame, old and deeply buried. "You're right to doubt me," he said. "So I won't ask you to trust my words. I'll show you instead." He set the folder down on the small dresser beside the door. Tomorrow, I'm moving legal ownership of a private trust into Kunle's name, assets my father doesn't know exist, held through a shell company outside Song or Kwon family reach. Whatever happens with the wedding, whatever Haewon's family tries, my son will never again be one signature away from disappearing. Amara's breath caught. You called him your son. He is my son. Taemin's voice was low, but it carried the particular steadiness of a man who had just, in his own private way, made a vow. And I intend to be worthy of that, starting now, even if it takes me the rest of my life to make up for the 6 years I already lost. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. There's a gala in 10 days, Kwon Enterprises' spring shareholders reception, the same night my father plans to formally announce the merger and the engagement to the board. His eyes met hers, dark and resolved. I need you and Kunle there, not hidden in the staff quarters. In the room. Amara's heart pounded. Your father will have me removed the moment he understands what he's looking at. Let him try, Tae-min said, something almost like the ghost of his younger self, the man in the Lagos garden, flickering across his face. For 6 years, I did exactly what he asked of me. That ends in 10 days. He left, closing the door softly behind him. And Amara sat back down on the edge of Kunle's bed, staring at the manila folder on the dresser, at the sleeping face of the boy who had just, without knowing it, been handed a future his mother had died trying to secure for him. 10 days. She had 10 days to prepare a 5-year-old, and herself, to walk into the middle of a war neither of them had chosen. The Kwon Enterprises' spring reception was held in the grand ballroom of the Seoul headquarters, glass walls rising 40 floors above the Han River, chandeliers throwing gold light across 300 of the country's most powerful shareholders, executives, and their spouses. Song Haewon stood at the center of it in a champagne-colored gown, Taemin's ring catching the light every time she gestured, playing her role with the practiced ease of a woman who had rehearsed this exact evening in her mind for months. She did not expect the doors at the far end of the ballroom to open, 40 minutes into the reception, and reveal Kwon Tae-min walking in beside a Nigerian woman in elegant deep blue Agbada-inspired formal wear, holding the hand of a small boy in a miniature matching suit, his hair neatly combed, his eyes wide and solemn as he took in the enormous room. The ballroom's conversation dimmed by degrees, like a wave pulling back before it crashes. Kwon Sang-ho, 73 years old and still the iron fist behind Kwon Enterprises, despite having formally retired the chairmanship to his son 2 years earlier, set down his champagne glass with the particular precision of a man controlling his fury in public. Tae-min, he said, low, as his son approached the small raised platform where the family traditionally greeted guests. What is the meaning of this? Father. Taemin's voice carried deliberately further than a private conversation should. I'd like to introduce someone to the board before tonight's announcements proceed. He turned, gesturing to the boy at his side, whose small hand tightened instinctively around Amara's fingers. This is Kunle Adeyemi, my son. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight, that presses against the chest of everyone standing inside it. Haewon's champagne-colored smile did not so much fall as shatter, fractured into a dozen expressions in the span of 1 second. Shock, calculation, fury, and buried beneath it all, something that looked almost like fear. Tae-min, she said, moving toward him with the composure of a woman still trying to salvage the room. Perhaps this conversation belongs somewhere more private. You knew, Tae-min said, turning to her, and his voice had dropped into the register that made board members flinch in negotiation rooms. You've known for weeks, long enough to threaten his mother, his aunt, forgive me, the woman who raised him after his mother died, protecting my family's secrets, and tell her to disappear before our wedding. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Phones discreetly began to lift. That's not. Haewon's composure cracked audibly. You don't understand the full situation. I understand it perfectly. Tae-min reached into his jacket and withdrew a small recording device, the same call, recaptured from his own end, that had started this entire unraveling 10 days earlier. He didn't play it. He didn't need to. Simply holding it up, watching the blood leave Haewon's face, told the room everything they needed to know. I understand that while my father was arranging our engagement as a corporate transaction, you were already planning to erase an innocent child the moment it became inconvenient to your merger. Enough. Kwon Sang-ho's voice cut through the ballroom like a blade, and for a moment, father and son locked eyes. Decades of unspoken tension crystallizing into a single, unbearable silence. You will not humiliate this family in front of the entire board over somewhat, father? Taemin's voice shook, not with uncertainty, but with a fury 6 years in the making. Some woman you paid to disappear from my life? Some child you'd have preferred never existed because his mother wasn't born into the right family, the right country, the right skin? I know what you did in Lagos 6 years ago. I know why Ngozi Adeyemi's letters stopped coming. And I have spent 6 years grieving a woman who was alive and struggling to raise my son alone, because you decided that decision belonged to you instead of me. A murmur swept through the crowd. Sharp with scandal, sympathy, and shareholder anxiety all tangled together. Amara felt Kunle's small hand trembling in hers and crouched instinctively beside him, shielding him from the wall of eyes now turned toward their small family. "You're doing so well, baby," she whispered in Yoruba, the language slipping out instinctively in the one moment she needed comfort more than English could offer. So brave. Almost done. But it wasn't almost done. Kwon Sang-ho's eyes had shifted from his son to the boy, something calculating moving behind his controlled fury. The same look. Amara realized with dread that businessmen wore when they were no longer arguing from anger, but strategizing from threat. "If this child's parentage is even genuine," Sang-ho said, loud enough for the nearby board members to hear clearly, which remains entirely unverified in this room tonight, "then we are looking at a fraud attempt by an illegal domestic worker using a child to extort a merger-critical family. Security. The DNA results are already in Song Mingu's possession," Tae-min interrupted, and the ballroom's attention swiveled instantly toward Haewon's uncle, standing pale near the bar. "Confirmed weeks ago. Isn't that right, uncle?" His eyes hadn't left his father's face. "The Song family has known the truth longer than I have, father. They were simply waiting to see whether it was more profitable to hide it or use it against me." Kwon Sang-ho's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time in the entire evening, the old man looked, however briefly, uncertain. Near the ballroom's side entrance, unnoticed in the growing chaos, 2 men in dark suits who did not belong to hotel security began moving quietly toward Amara and Kunle. Men whose faces Amara recognized with a jolt of pure terror from a photograph Tae-min had shown her 3 nights earlier. Men employed not by Kwon Enterprises, but by Song Mingu's private security detail. "Tae-min," Amara said sharply, her voice cutting through the ballroom's rising noise, "we need to leave. Now." Tae-min turned, followed her gaze to the 2 approaching men, and his entire body went rigid with an emotion Amara had never once seen cross his composed features in 8 months. Pure, unfiltered fear. Not for himself, but for the small boy gripping his aunt's hand 3 feet away from danger neither of them had anticipated walking into. "Get behind me," Tae-min said, already moving, placing himself between Amara, Kunle, and the 2 approaching men in a single fluid motion that spoke of instincts far older and rougher than boardroom negotiations. This was the part of Kwon Enterprises that shareholders never saw in press releases. The part built generations ago on protection contracts and quiet arrangements with men who solved problems the courts couldn't touch. "Mr. Kwon," the taller of the 2 men said, his tone carefully neutral, professionally courteous, the kind of voice trained to de-escalate a room even while executing a threat. "Miss Song asked us to escort the woman and the child somewhere quieter, given the sensitivity of the situation." "Miss Song has no authority in this building," Tae-min said, his voice flat and final. "And you will not touch either of them." Around them, the ballroom's murmur had shifted into something closer to real alarm. Shareholders backing toward the walls, a few reaching for phones, one elderly board member's wife letting out a small, startled cry as she registered belatedly that this was not simply a scandal unfolding, but potentially something far more dangerous. Kwon Sang-ho, watching from the raised platform, made a decision in the space of a single breath, the kind of decision that had built his empire and, just as often, nearly destroyed it. "Stand down," He barked at the two men, his voice carrying the particular authority of a man they clearly still answered to on some level, whether officially or not. Not here. Not in front of 300 witnesses and a dozen phones already recording. The men hesitated, glancing toward Song Min-gu near the bar, who gave the faintest shake of his head, an order withdrawn as quickly as it had been issued, its exposure now a greater liability than its success. Haewon stood frozen in the center of the room, watching her carefully constructed evening collapse in real time, watching her father's merger, her family's financial lifeline, her own future, all unraveling under the weight of a truth she'd tried to bury instead of confront. "I didn't want it to go this far," she said quietly, to Tae-min, though her voice carried further than she perhaps intended, catching on the edge of the stunned silence around them. "I panicked. My father's company is drowning, Tae-min. This merger was the only thing keeping thousands of employees from losing their jobs. I was trying to protect something too." "Then you should have told me the truth," Tae-min said, and though his voice had softened fractionally, it hadn't forgiven her. Instead of threatening a grieving woman raising an orphan child alone, there were 100 honest paths through this. You chose the one that required erasing an innocent 5-year-old from his own father's life. Haewon's composure finally broke entirely, tears cutting tracks through her careful makeup as 300 of Seoul's most powerful people watched. What was I supposed to do? Congratulate you? Step aside gracefully while my family's company burns? "You were supposed to be honest," Amara said quietly, stepping forward despite Tae-min's protective stance, Kunle's hand still firmly in hers. Every eye in the ballroom turned toward her. The maid, the outsider, the woman whose existence had just detonated a merger worth billions of won. "My sister loved this man enough to protect his family's secret for 6 years, even as it cost her everything, her health, her time, eventually her life. She never once threatened anyone. She simply waited and hoped and raised her son with more grace than most people in this room have ever had to summon. You had every opportunity to come to Tae-min honestly about your family's struggles. Instead, you chose to threaten a child." Her voice, though it shook, did not break. "There's a difference between protecting your family and destroying someone else's to do it." The ballroom was utterly silent now, 300 people caught in the gravity of a truth too raw for the champagne-lit elegance around them. Kwon Sang-ho descended from the platform slowly, his cane tapping against the marble floor, and for a long, terrible moment, Amara thought he was coming to finish what his men had started. Instead, he stopped in front of Kunle, crouching with visible effort until he was at the boy's eye level. The same eyes, Amara realized with a jolt, that belonged to 3 generations of Kwon men now standing in this room. "You have your grandmother's chin," the old man said quietly, so quietly only those nearest could hear it. "She used to say I was too stubborn to admit when I was wrong. She would have liked that you finally forced me to." He straightened, turning to face the stunned ballroom, and when he spoke again, his voice had regained its formidable public register. But something in it had shifted, some old certainty finally cracking under the weight of 6 years of buried guilt. "The engagement between Kwon Enterprises and the Song Group," he announced, "is dissolved, effective tonight. The merger will proceed only under renegotiated terms that do not require a marriage contract. Terms my son and I will discuss privately on his authority, not mine." Haewon's face went white. Somewhere near the bar, Song Min-gu had already begun moving toward the exit, phone pressed to his ear, damage control beginning before the ballroom had even finished processing what it had just witnessed. Tae-min turned to his father, something unreadable passing between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the first fragile thread of it. "There's something else you should know," Sang-ho said, lower now, meant only for his son, "about why I did what I did 6 years ago. About your mother." His eyes flicked briefly toward Amara and Kunle. "It isn't the reason you think." Tae-min went very still. What does that mean? But before Sang-ho could answer, a commotion erupted near the ballroom's main entrance. Raised voices, a security officer's radio crackling urgently, and every head in the room turned as 2 uniformed police detectives entered, flanked by hotel security, scanning the crowd with the particular urgency of people who had come for someone specific. "We're looking for a Miss Amara Adeyemi," the lead detective announced, in connection with an active investigation into falsified immigration documents. Amara's blood turned to ice. Beside her, Kunle looked up at her face, sensing without understanding that something had just gone terribly wrong. For one suspended, terrible second, Amara thought her legs might give out beneath her. 300 guests. 2 detectives. Her worst fear, standing in a doorway in a rented tuxedo of authority, come to take her away from the only family she had left in the world. On what grounds? Tae-min's voice cracked across the ballroom before Amara could even form a response, already moving to stand between her and the detectives with the same fierce, immediate protectiveness he'd shown moments earlier against Song Mingu's men. "An anonymous tip was filed 2 days ago," the detective said, unfolding a printed document, alleging that Ms. Adeyemi entered the country on a falsified work visa under a fraudulent employment sponsorship and has been residing illegally with a minor child of uncertain guardianship status. 2 days ago, Amara's mind raced. 2 days ago was after the gala invitation, after Tae-min's promise, after the trust had been established in Kunle's name. Someone had moved fast to make sure that whatever happened tonight, there would be a legal weapon waiting in reserve. Her eyes found Song Mingu near the exit, and though his face remained carefully neutral, something in the too still set of his shoulders told her everything she needed to know. "The tip is accurate in one respect and completely false in every other," Tae-min said, his voice regaining the cold precision of a man used to dismantling arguments in boardrooms. Miss Adeyemi's original employment sponsorship documents contained inaccuracies. Inaccuracies she made under duress, fearing for her safety and her nephew's, after my own family's associates threatened her sister's business in Lagos 6 years ago to suppress a relationship my father found inconvenient. That is a matter of Kwon family liability, not immigration fraud on her part. "Regardless of the circumstances, sir, the law requires—" "The boy," Tae-min interrupted, "is not of uncertain guardianship status. He is my biological son, confirmed by DNA testing in the possession of the Song family's own legal team, and as of 9 days ago, the legal beneficiary of a private trust I established in his name. Miss Adeyemi has been his legal guardian since his mother's death, a fact I am prepared to formalize through Korean family court immediately. Tonight, if necessary, with full legal representation." The detective hesitated, clearly unprepared for the scale of what he'd walked into. A scandal already unfolding in front of 300 witnesses, half of them recording, a chairman's son publicly claiming paternity, and now a legal complexity well above the pay grade of a standard immigration inquiry. "I'll need to verify all of this through proper channels," the detective said carefully. "Verify it," Tae-min said. "But she leaves with her family tonight, and any further action goes through my legal counsel, not a hallway interrogation at a shareholder's reception." He turned, briefly, toward his father, a silent question passing between them, the first real alliance either had offered the other in years. Kwon Sang-ho's jaw tightened, old pride visibly warring with something newer, rawer, guilt, perhaps, or the beginning of it. "The Kwon family's legal team will handle Miss Adeyemi's status personally," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the ballroom. "Effective immediately. Any further inquiries should be directed to Kwon Enterprises' general counsel." It wasn't forgiveness. Amara understood that clearly, watching the old man's carefully controlled face. It was damage control, pride repositioning itself, an old general recognizing a battle he could no longer win by force. But it was also undeniably protection. The first the Kwon family had ever offered her directly instead of taking it away. The detectives exchanged a glance, clearly recalculating the political weight of the room they'd walked into, and after a tense, murmured exchange, withdrew toward the entrance, promising follow-up through official channels rather than force. The moment they were gone, the ballroom exhaled as one organism, 300 conversations erupting simultaneously into a roar of whispered scandal and disbelief. Amara sank down beside Kunle, pulling him into her arms, her whole body shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. "It's okay, baby," she murmured into his hair, half to comfort him, half to convince herself. "We're okay. Was that man going to take you away? Kunle whispered, his small voice trembling. No, baby. Not tonight. Not ever, if I have anything to say about it. Tae-min had crouched down beside them, his voice gentler than Amara had ever heard it, meant only for the boy. He hesitated, glancing at Amara for permission, and when she gave the smallest nod, he continued. Kunle, do you know who I am to you? The boy studied him with the unguarded seriousness only children possess. Uncle Tae-min. That's true, Tae-min said, his voice catching slightly. But there's something else true, too. Something I only found out recently myself, and I should have known your whole life, and I'm sorry it took me this long. He took a breath. I'm your father, Kunle. Your mother and I loved each other very much, a long time ago, before you were born. Kunle's eyes went wide, flicking between Tae-min's face and Amara's, searching for confirmation. Amara nodded through tears she could no longer hold back. My mama said my papa was far away, Kunle said slowly, working through it with the particular gravity of a 5-year-old processing something enormous. She said he would find me someday, if the story was meant to. She was right, Tae-min said, his own composure finally, completely breaking, tears cutting silent tracks down a face that hadn't allowed itself to cry in 6 years. I found you. I'm so sorry it took so long. Across the ballroom, forgotten in the emotional gravity of the small family reunion at its center, Song Hae-won slipped quietly toward the exit, her carefully built future collapsing around her, and in the shadow of the doorway, unnoticed by anyone except a single sharp-eyed photographer capturing the entire scene for tomorrow's front page, Kwon Sang-ho watched his son embrace the grandson he had spent 6 years pretending didn't exist, his own face wet with tears he would later deny, in his private study, had ever fallen. 6 weeks later, the story had already become legend in the way certain stories do. Passed between churchgoers in Atlanta congregations, whispered over hair salon chairs in Lagos, dissected on Korean entertainment programs that had for once found a chaebol scandal with a genuinely happy ending instead of a tragic one. The Kwon family legal team had formalized everything with the same precision Tae-min brought to every boardroom negotiation. Amara's residency status secured permanently, not as a favor but as compensation for 6 years of harm his own family had caused hers. Kunle's paternity acknowledged publicly and legally, his name changed, with the boy's own excited input, to Kwon Adeyemi, a name that honored both halves of who he was. Song Hae-won's family in the scandal's aftermath had quietly restructured their merger terms without the marriage clause. Their company's survival now depended on genuine partnership rather than manufactured alliance. A humbling but not unsurvivable outcome, and Hae-won herself, in a small act of grace no one expected, had sent Amara a private letter weeks later. Not quite an apology, but close to one, an admission that fear had made her cruel. And that watching a stranger's courage in that ballroom had taught her something about the difference between protecting a family and destroying one. Amara kept the letter. She didn't forgive easily, but she believed, the way her sister always had, in the possibility of people surprising you. Kwon Sang-ho's confession, the one interrupted by the detectives that night, had come slowly, over several difficult weeks of stilted conversation between father and son. It turned out his fear of Ngozi hadn't been about her nationality or her poverty, as Tae-min had assumed, but about an old family tragedy. Sang-ho's own younger sister had married outside the family's carefully constructed business alliances decades earlier, against his late father's wishes, and had died in circumstances the old man still refused to speak of in detail, a wound so old and so poorly healed that he had, in his own broken way, believed he was protecting his son from repeating it. It didn't excuse what he'd done. Tae-min told him so, plainly, more than once. But it explained it, and in families as complicated as theirs, Amara had come to understand, explanation was sometimes the fragile first bridge back towards something like healing. On a warm Saturday evening in early autumn, the Kwon family garden filled with an unlikely gathering. Korean board members standing awkwardly beside Nigerian church aunties who had flown in for the occasion, jollof rice served alongside japchae on the same long tables, a Yoruba praise song rising into the evening air minutes after a Korean pastor finished his blessing. It was, by any traditional standard on either side of the ocean, an unconventional celebration. It was, by every measure that mattered, exactly the kind of family Ngozi had always hoped her son would someday belong to. Amara stood near the koi pond, watching Kunle chase a butterfly through the garden exactly as he had 8 months earlier. Except now Tae-min ran beside him, laughing in a way she had never once heard from him during her first months in this house. And Kwon Sang-ho sat nearby in a garden chair, watching his grandson with an expression that had softened, week by careful week, into something almost like peace. "You did it," a voice said beside her. She turned to find Tae-min's aunt, a warm, sharp-eyed woman named Kwon Mi-suk, who had flown in from Busan for the celebration, and had, over the past weeks, become something like family to Amara in her own right. "Your sister's promise? You kept it." "We kept it," Amara corrected softly, watching Kunle tackle his father into the grass with a shriek of delighted laughter, watching Kwon Sang-ho laugh. Really laugh, for what she suspected was the first time in years. "I couldn't have finished it alone." Later that evening, after the guests had gone and the garden lanterns burned low, Tae-min found Amara sitting where she always sat when the day grew quiet, on the small bench near the koi pond, watching the water, the way she'd once told him she used to watch the lagoon behind her grandmother's house in Lagos as a girl, when the world felt too big and she needed somewhere still to think. "I never properly thanked you," he said, sitting beside her, "for 6 years of choices I'll never fully understand the weight of, for raising him when you had every reason to walk away and start a life of your own instead." "He's my sister's son," Amara said simply. "There was never a version of this where I walked away. Still." Tae-min was quiet for a moment, watching the koi move slow circles beneath the lantern light. "My father offered you a permanent position with the household staff today. A generous one with full benefits, a private cottage on the estate grounds." Amara raised an eyebrow. "Is that your way of asking if I'm staying?" "It's my way," Tae-min said, and something almost shy crossed his composed features, an expression Amara suspected very few people in his life had ever been permitted to see, of asking if you'd consider staying, not as staff, but as family, however you'd like to define that. Kunle's aunt living nearby always welcome, or... He stopped himself, visibly recalibrating the courage required for what he wanted to say next. "I'm not asking you to replace anything or step into anyone's shoes, but I've watched you raise my son with more grace and strength than I've seen in anyone in my life, including myself, and I would very much like the chance to know you, not as the woman who kept my secret, but as yourself, if you'd allow it." Amara studied him for a long moment, the lantern light flickering across water that had, for 8 strange and difficult months, become the closest thing to home she'd found since leaving Lagos. "Ngozi always said," she said finally, quietly, "that the story wasn't finished, that there was more waiting for us here than either of us understood yet." A small, unguarded smile broke across her face, the first Tae-min had ever seen entirely free of grief. "I suppose I'd like to find out if she was right." Above them, Kunle's laughter rang out from the house, chasing his grandfather through the halls in some invented game only the two of them understood. And in the quiet garden below, beneath lantern light and the soft, patient sound of water, a promise made across an ocean, and across years of silence, finally, fully came home. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about who shows up and who chooses to stay. Tell us in the comments, which moment hit you hardest? We read every single one.